Okay, you're good to go. Sorry about that.
Okay, no worries. Hey everyone, this is a talk on breaking into tech and why you would want to be a software engineer. I actually was talking a bit before this call, and I was saying how in this call I really want to emphasize two big things. The first is what software engineers are worth in the job industry today. And secondly, how do you get your proper worth as a software engineer? Um, and basically, how do you get those jobs that pay kind of the going market rate for a talented software engineer? So common myths I really want to dispel here are, you know, bad or worse engineers are only worth a certain amount. I don't think that's true. I think just about anyone in computer science who puts the time in to learn about core computer science concepts can really become a software engineer capable and worth earning that $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 type salary. Um, I think too many people sell themselves short here, especially people who don't end up going to, top computer science schools like Stanford or Berkeley or whatever. So that's really my goal here. Hopefully that fits everyone's expectations, but I'll, try to tell a compelling story as to why that matters throughout this talk. So to start, I'm James. I graduated from Cornell in 2018 as an economics major, so I actually didn't exactly benefit from the kind of environment that was around me. I didn't think that I could get this type of, six-figure starting salary out of university that tons of people in a bunch of my classes were getting. Pretty much because I didn't major in computer science. I did a minor in it, but I just kind of thought I didn't know enough. And that everyone who got these kinds of jobs had to know everything and had to know a lot of stuff that I just didn't know. And that's just simply not true. I did go on and get a master's to kind of try to close that gap and also just to help my own resume. So if you can, I would recommend majoring in computer science or something along those lines, whether it be software engineering or information science, something like that. It will help your resume a lot and help get you a lot more interviews. But if you don't, no worry, it's still possible to become a software engineer. It just may take some extra time or effort to build up that resume. If you don't have a computer science education and you're already graduated with something like an economics major, then I'd really recommend taking some of my advice that I'll go through later in the talk. Or if you really want an extra leg up, then you could also consider a master's in computer science. I would just emphasize that an in-person master's in computer science costs a lot of money. That's why I did an online one with a total cost of around like $5,000, because that allowed me to get that resume item without paying 100 grand for it. I currently work as a software engineer at PayPal. I don't work in typical product development, so that is something that I can talk about towards the end of the talk. But basically, what most software engineers do is pretty, not exactly standard, but I would say a significant portion of software engineer jobs are either front-end development or back-end development, and I'm on frameworks. So we lean a bit more towards the skills you need for back-end software development, but we're kind of in a different realm entirely because we do not, build REST APIs on a regular basis. I've previously run CodeDays in Florida, um, Illinois, and run CodeDay Bellevue. I think that might be wrong, but anyway, I've also run CS fairs around the country and volunteered at a few others. So I've been involved in CodeDay for a long time. I actually started down the path of learning computer science because I was involved in CodeDay. So I think at the end of my first year of undergrad, I ran a CodeDay. I realized, hey, I probably need to know how to code if I'm going to be teaching people how to code. That set me down a path of doing the minor. And when I graduated, I realized just how much easier it was to find interviews and opportunities for software engineering jobs and jobs in tech compared to a lot of the finance or consulting type jobs that I was thinking I would go into after undergrad as an economics major. So that kind of goes into the purpose of this talk. I ended up as a software engineer and I really enjoy it. And I think that it's a great industry to be in. So I want to answer two main questions. One is, why should you become a software engineer? And the other is, how do you become a software engineer? And I don't mean how do you learn all the right stuff to become a software engineer. I don't even mean like, how do you, start, calling yourself a software engineer. I mostly mean, how do you get that opportunity to be in a, job where you're coding, in a job where you're compensated highly. So that's really what I'm going to be focusing on. So I have one question for the audience here, and that is, how much does software engineering pay? You can give me a mean, median, range, whatever you want, but can some folks give a guess in the Q&A? One person says 120,000, one says 70 to 150. I'll wait a few more seconds before I give an answer. One person gave 120K plus in San Francisco specifically. One person said 100K. So I think that's a good range to start with. So the government does classify different jobs, and they give a median salary of software engineers at $107,000 a year. I would say that there is more to that story. Let's see. Because not all software engineers earn the same, and that's really one key thing I want to get across. This isn't really based off of what job function you have. One thing I would say is that certain companies just pay more. I think for most companies that you have ever heard of, you can go and look it up on this website, levels.fyi, and it will give you a good idea of how much they pay. I'll include a figure of it in a bit, but for now, just keep in mind, some companies pay more, some companies pay less. For the ones that pay less, I'm going to just put out there that most people I know at companies that pay less typically tend to be people who don't really know what they're worth. They don't know that they are fully capable and talented and able of doing the exact same job of someone earning 3, 4, or 5 times as much as them. So I would say, some real emphasis here on, if you were thinking less than that $107,000 mark, then you should try to reevaluate, look at what some of these other companies pay, and just know that if you just try to get interviews with those companies, if you kind of do all the steps right to be able to get and pass those interviews, then you can fully well, manage with a job that pays well more than 107. So really the main motivation behind jobs that pay maybe 60 or 70,000 as a software engineer tend to be if you're just a bit less comfortable with your software engineering skills and you want that experience before you get into a job. But another thing to note is that the companies that pay more tend to be the ones that are willing to invest in their employees. They tend to be the ones where if you don't know something initially, that's okay. And they expect you to take 6 months to a year on the job where you are ramping up and getting all the knowledge and experience necessary to do that job well. And on top of that, if you are entering one of these big companies as a new graduate out of college, they tend to give you a bit extra leeway beyond that. So a lot of companies have maybe a formal or maybe an informal process where they might have a boot camp initially where they spend 3 weeks to 3 months just putting you through some kind of core curriculum so that you can get on board and understand what you need to know for your job. So I think Facebook is one of the famous ones that do that. I think they have a kind of like new hire curriculum that is pretty extensive. And they actually pay really high. And I'll try to show a graph of some of that later. But even informally, a lot of university recruiting programs will usually give like a 1 to 2 year leeway where you tend to be, safe from any kind of, I guess, negative negative types of reviews. So like even if you're doing a bit poorly, you tend to get, kind of mentored or led through improving that, as opposed to being at risk of losing your job. So really, that is something that is not found within a lot of other industries. And it's one extra reason why software engineering is a good career to be in, is because I think I'm getting ahead of myself here I don't have it. But basically, like you're basically getting paid to learn on the job as a software engineer. Maybe once you get to 10 or 20 years in your career, that lessens a bit and you're expected to be able to kind of uh, know certain things off the bat. But if you ever, even 20 years down your career, if you end up getting a software engineering job, it doesn't necessarily need to be in a software stack that you know, and it will be completely understood that you will take, 3 to 9 months to onboard onto that tech stack, onto the proprietary technology of that company. So they're never really going to expect you to know everything. It will kind of reduce in how much leeway you get to like learn things that you need to know as you go on in your career. But for the most part, it's a pretty forgiving industry. Um, there are exceptions. I don't plan on going into them all too much until Q&A at the end. But startups and certain companies do have a reputation for being a bit more demanding. Um, and so there are definitely software engineering jobs, software engineering roles, software engineering teams where they do expect you to just put in an extra 10, 20 hours per week to learn what you need to know. But to that, I would also say if you handle things in the right way, if you try to get ahead of learning what you need to know, then you're not going to have that kind of time commitment forever. You may need that kind of time commitment when you're onboarding, when you're learning, or maybe when you're starting a new project. But on a regular basis, like 40 hours a week is not uncommon. And depending on the company that you're at and depending on the standards that you set with your management, you can definitely ensure somewhere around 40 hours a week on average in a lot of companies. And I would say the majority of tech companies, especially the ones that tend to pay a bit higher, tend to be a bit more forgiving there. So also like not all software engineers earn the same because some of the higher paying jobs require a certain amount of technical information. I wouldn't say that relates to certain tech stacks. So it's not like, if you know JavaScript, you'll get paid $100,000 more. Instead, it tends to be something like at a company like Amazon or Google, they tend to be working with really large amounts of data. And the ways in which they, operate essentially require a certain amount of, scalability and good design to make it so that that code base can be maintained well and can handle all the traffic or the throughput that they need. So what that really ends up meaning is that sometimes you need to be able to design these scalable or more efficient systems that can lean anything from, hey, you need to know cloud because cloud is, how they run their applications, how they run their systems, to you need to know multi-threading to, spend less on servers, to maybe you even need to know some basics of computer systems so that you're not adding in some, obscure security vulnerability into your code. This may sound like some stuff that, people here might not have heard of before, but really at the end of the day, what it means is that if you don't know some of this, as you get into, companies like PayPal or like Facebook, then you will probably need to pick it up. Some of it can be a bit technically challenging. So if you don't know multi-threading, then chances are you're going to try to write code using multi-threading. It's going to have, data being lost, or it won't be as efficient as it could be. But the thing is, you can go and you can read a book on multi-threading. 100, 200 pages later, you can get the core concepts, and then you get experience through working with it every day. Your coworkers will go through code reviews with you, and they'll suggest the best practices for doing this kind of stuff. and you'll start to learn it. So it's not exactly something you need to know right off the bat. But as you go through in your career, you will need to learn some of these more complex subjects. And I would just say, don't be afraid of it. I know a lot of people who really lean towards front end web development, and nothing against front end web development, but the salaries do tend a little lower than back end development. So I would really emphasize, like, don't be afraid of some of this more technical stuff. If you love web development, definitely go and do that. But don't choose it just out of default of you don't think that you can understand these technical subjects, because there's only a small amount of the stuff that you're actually expected to know going into a new grad type job, and the rest of it you can kind of learn along the way. um, it's definitely better to be prepared, and I'll go over some of those subjects that I would recommend knowing before trying to get a first internship or first job, and that will come towards the end. But in general, like, you can definitely learn on the job in software engineering. So just to share some idea of salaries, for reference, Band 6 and L3 at IBM and Google respectively are new grad level. So a new grad at IBM is making just about 100. A new grad at Google is making just about 200. This can vary depending on if you have uh, multiple job offers, then you can usually negotiate with them to get it higher. A lot of the time you can negotiate it even if you only have one job offer, and they're usually able to go like 10 to 20% higher. But as you get a bit more in your career, like after 2 or 3 years, you might be band 7, L4 respectively, and then your salary will go up, $40,000, $50,000, depending on the company. And on the like super talented edge, like for Google, L8 is probably the cutoff where I would say, okay, maybe not everyone can do that job, but you don't need to be able to do that job to make a lot of money in the technology industry. So there are lots of companies. Usually, the highest level is like you are some of the best and most well-known engineers in the world. So for reference, I think the founder of Python was an L8 at Google for a long time. And so that kind of makes sense as to why they're making maybe $1 million a year. But you don't need to be at that, L8 level to be able to make a lot of money. Uh, I I still think that 100 is so much more money than I would have expected out of undergrad. And it's really common in the tech industry for people to be making upwards of $300,000 or $400,000, even if you're not anywhere near like cream of the crop quality like an L8 Google engineer might be. Um, there's These are taken from levels.fyi. There's a lot of good salary information on there, so you can look up kind of what different companies pay. I would say a lot of these higher salaries, like the $500,000 plus salaries, tend to be in San Francisco. So it's interesting that we got a guess of 120,000 plus for San Francisco, because I would say that's kind of the low end for San Francisco. Um, Not to say that under 120 in San Francisco is a bad salary, but to say that, if you're in San Francisco, you can probably manage to get like bare minimum of 200,000 or more. Um, and again, I'm really not trying to disparage anyone with a lower salary. It's more that I really want to emphasize, no, you don't need to take a $50,000 or $60,000 job out of undergrad as a CS major because you think that you're not capable. You really are like just as capable as any L3 at Google or anyone who gets up to L5 at Google. You just need to get the right opportunity and get up to the right level. Someone asked, are these pay ranges for new engineers or junior level? I answered that a bit before, like band 6. So like the left-hand column on each of these graphs is like new grad level. So new engineer, junior level. I would also stress that the term junior software engineer usually is like not a great term, because if you look up like the lowest level of engineer at any company, Google, IBM, Facebook, whatever well-known company they tend not to use that term. the only companies that use junior in their job titles um, tend to be ones that pay under market rate, in my experience. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part, like, don't aim for junior engineer positions, aim for like the lowest level engineer positions as a new grad. So apply to Google positions that are like 0 to 2 years of experience, apply to Google's new grad program, apply to Microsoft's new grad program. And then, you know, half the difficulty is getting the interview and the other half is passing it. So I'll go into both of those in a bit. But really, like, there are so many companies out there where if you give it a shot and you get like 5 interviews, then as long as you prepare well, you are likely to get over $150,000 starting salary. Not a guarantee. Again, like, no one should just assume that they can magically make this money. But like, if you are capable of learning in general in the computer science field, in the software and technology field, then these are definitely like attainable amounts for starting salary out of college. So again, just getting paid this kind of ridiculous salary level is just so much easier for a software engineer than for other jobs. If you go into, say, consulting or something, you may be spending 5-10 years before you get into the $100,000 range, even if you're at one of the biggest companies like McKinsey. If you go into investment banking, you're going to be spending 90, 100-hour weeks for a good 2-3 years before you hit this point. It's not entirely cut and dry, but like, the salaries for software engineer are just so much higher and so much more attainable than in other industries, especially because a lot of those other high-paying industries tend to lean more towards, do you know someone who can give you a referral? Like, does your family friend work as a managing director of a consulting company or like investment firm? If not, then you might have a hard time getting into those companies if you're not from an Ivy League school. Whereas in software engineering, I know plenty of people from any state school, from any community college who are able to get like bare minimum 70, but most of the people at that level are definitely competent enough to be able to make 100, 150, 200. So a lot of it is really aim for the top paying companies because you'll probably surprise yourself. And as long as you prepare the right way, then you are a fully well-qualified candidate. And yeah, on that note, like, the people making these insane salaries at these well-known tech companies are not more special than anyone listening to this call. They may have worked in the past in companies like this. They may be familiar with some of the tech stacks that these companies use, but there's no reason that anyone here cannot go look up how to use GraphQL. There's no reason that anyone here can't apply to these companies with a strong resume to get in. And I'll go a bit more into like how to get interviews and how to become a good candidate in a second. But some of the people working at these companies may have degrees from top universities. Some may have a lot of experience, but really the hardest thing is going to be getting in the door, getting that interview opportunity. And then it's really like all about preparation for the interview process. One thing I always love to quote is a good friend of mine who was actually an attendee at the first CodeDay I ran, was quoted in a CodeDay blog post as saying, anything can be found if you Google hard enough. That, in some ways, that was my cop-out, as I hadn't really learned too much about how to code before running that event. So I was often telling them to Google stuff. But it really is true. Like, if you want to solve, let's say that your computer is crashing, you don't know why, you tend to Google it and you can find some good answers. The same thing is basically true for most of software engineering. Even if it's something more complex, like how do I create an Android app, or how do I create an Android app that does X, Y, or Z? How do I clone Twitter or something? You can usually find just about everything you need to know to do that if you just Google for it. Some stuff is harder than others if it's more obscure, but in general, there's this endless resource called the internet, and most software engineers, probably more so the ones that are paid more, are just really good at looking stuff up. No $500,000 compensated software engineer knows the answer to every single question. But when they write code or they try to design a system, they're looking things up. They're, looking at engineering blogs from a top company and saying, how did they design their system? What do we need? What's different between them? And what can I learn from how best to design that based off of what was done before me? So that can really be anything as simple as, how do I do this? How do I reverse a string? You can Google, you can find a code snippet from Stack Overflow for that, to how do I design this really complex system? Oh, this other company did it. Maybe we have to change some stuff, but that is where we can start. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can really learn just by looking up that information. So you really shouldn't feel intimidated by, hey, it's Facebook, hey, it's Google, because as long as you can get in that job, chances are you can learn how to do that job once you get there. Of course, like, I'm not going to say that works kind of between job levels, but if you join, Google as a, new software engineer, you can learn everything you need to know for that. And then as you progress to, a level 2 job, then once you get there, you're building off of all that information from that level 1 job, but you can learn everything you need for that, next level job when you get there, and so on and so forth. So again, as I mentioned, there are a few key concepts needed as you, get to some of the higher paying tech companies, or as you get to the higher roles, higher like job roles. But in general, you can Google most of what you need to know. So really getting the job ends up being the hardest part. I am kind of giving this talk to try to help and to try to give some kind of resources and knowledge that everyone here can use to like start their own experience of preparing to get those top internships and top jobs. I will take a pause here to answer a question. Someone asked, do you recommend students to focus on learning iOS development or Android? I would almost say neither. There's almost more useful stuff to focus on first. If you're at a point where you know some of the basics I'll get to in a slide or two, then by all means, you can branch out into iOS development or Android development. I wouldn't say I have a strong preference for either. I think iOS as a niche has a lot of opportunities available, but like Android development is very in demand right now. So both are good options. Mobile development in general is a good option, but the bulk majority of software engineering jobs tend to be more around backend development, and tend to, as a result, require you to be at least familiar with some of these other key concepts. And mobile developers tend to need to know them as well. So I really emphasize like learn kind of this core set first before trying to dive into iOS development or Android development. So in roughly priority order, I would say that these are the most helpful things for getting, interviews for good internships or good jobs in software engineering. Number one is going to be if you can get an internship at a well-known company. This really can range from, small company to big company, high paying to low paying. But chances are, if you get a job at a company someone knows the name of, then you'll have a much easier time getting an interview in the future. So for example, once I started working at, or, once I did an internship at PayPal, I had a much easier time getting interviews for software engineering jobs in general. So, before the internship, I got a few opportunities, but not too many that were super notable. And after the internship, I got interviews from like LinkedIn and a bunch of other companies. So like an internship at a well-known company really makes the best difference. It basically opens doors for you where recruiters are reaching out to you instead of you needing to go and find opportunities. And I will add in, I did end up taking a return offer to go back to PayPal. So I did like it. And, internships aren't only just about building up a resume, they can also be about finding a company that you want to work at. But after that, I would say research with a computer science professor. So if your computer science teaching staff does research at your school, then I would definitely recommend contacting them as soon as possible and say, just, hey, I'm interested in working with you on some research. What do you work on? And, is there any way that I could contribute or help? Chances are they would be happy to have you. Um, this will depend on the university. I know that at Cornell, where I did undergrad, it was a bit more difficult because, every professor would have hundreds of students going to them and saying, hey, can I help? But if you're at a less computer science heavy school, you can definitely like find an opportunity one way or another. Even at Cornell, there were kind of tangential fields where you could definitely get involved in research. So like the information science professors at Cornell tended to be a bit like easier to get research with. And if any of them end up seeing this, I don't mean to slight them, just like most students kind of focus on like, the core computer science professors first and then branch out into tangential fields. So you could get involved that way. You could even get involved in research that isn't computer science related. Like if you can find an English professor who wants to automate some kind of analysis of, books, then that is going to be computing heavy. You may not learn as much from like mentorship by that professor, but you will learn a lot just from doing that work, and that will make just as good of a resume item. Number 3 is open source contributions. I would recommend just go to an open source library on GitHub, look at what the pull requests and issues are saying. That will teach you so much. And if you can like complete an issue on an open source repository, you will see how much easier it is than you would expect. I only started doing this kind of after I started full-time work, but like my first open source contribution was to one of the largest open source libraries, which is Apache Commons for Java. And it was like basically a one-line docs change or a typo fix or something. So even just the bare bones of doing that can help you a lot and give you a big leg up on other people. Obviously, recruiters or at least hiring managers aren't going to give much merit to someone who only has docs fixes. But like if you start with docs fixes and then go up to bug fixes and then go up to feature adding, the more you do, the better there. Try to get more complex with your contributions, but it's a great way to build up a resume. In addition to that, if you're contributing to an open source project, the other people working on that project tend to be developers at big companies. So PayPal, for example, has open source projects. If you contribute to our Java GraphQL open source project, or if you contribute to our application transformation project, both open source, you are working with someone in my larger team. He is super friendly. He can help you learn, first off, and then secondly, like, no guarantees about my company or anything, but in general, an engineer is probably going to be pretty happy to give an interview to someone who they have already been working with in open source. They know what you're capable of. I'll pause here for a second to answer some questions. One is, what are some things research might entail or mean? I gave an example there a second ago. So if you work with an English professor, you might be trying to automate like text processing and be looking for words in like 1,000 PDFs. That is a fun type of project. I've done something along those lines before, not as research, but as personal projects. That is fun. That is maybe not the most technically difficult, so it's something you could learn yourself without that kind of mentorship that you might get from a more technical professor. But that is a great resume boost. I did some research when I was in grad school, working with a professor who focused on certain types of accessibility and like inclusive technology. And so what we ended up doing was trying to make these like 3D tactile maps. So if you think about like Google Maps, right, you need to look at it and you see where streets are. But in a tactile map, it's for people who have, vision disabilities. And so it's a 3D map where, someone can feel where are the roads, where are the buildings or trees, things like that. And so what that really looked like was going into, I believe it was Python. I'm going into Python and writing something to convert data that was like about street data and converting that into a 3D model. So in that process, there was a lot of mentorship. There was a lot of people in that lab willing to help and willing to point me in the right directions. So you end up learning a lot and also building up a great resume item. Next question is it worth moving to Silicon Valley to chase tech jobs because they tend to pay more, or does the cost of living even out? I've done some of this math. I work in a state with no income tax. If I were to move to California, I would need to earn about $100,000 more in order to take home the same amount of money. So that gives some idea. And I would say there's definitely opportunities that would fit that bill. But I'm also, personally, I'm not in a state where I would want to change companies because I have a good tech job already. And it would also, to be blunt, it would be a lot of effort to try to get a job that pays that much at my level. It may not be that much effort. I mean, that kind of salary is not uncommon in Silicon Valley, but I'm happy where I am and I probably wouldn't do that. But I would say it's always worth, it's worth trying to get those interviews if you're looking to change companies. Try to take those interviews, try to get those job offers, and then if they aren't going to pay more after cost of living, after taxes, then you can try to negotiate it up. And if they can't get it to a point where it's higher than you would be making somewhere else, then you don't need to take that job. Next question is for people from more untraditional backgrounds, such as people with computer science degrees, people without computer science degrees, but with computer science experience, how can they be more qualified for software engineering jobs? This slide and a slide in a bit, we'll get into that. So I'll just kind of skip that question for now. And I encourage you to ask more questions in about 5 minutes after I've gone through that. So back to these slides. Number 4 on my list was major in computer science. A lot of people try to say that you don't need to be a computer science major to be a software engineer. And I entirely agree with that to an extent that as a new grad, it is much easier to get interviews if you have a computer science major than if you don't. I experienced that firsthand, having an economics major and a computer science minor definitely did not get me as many interviews as I would have gotten if I were a computer science major. Next would be internships at less known companies. If you get an opportunity at a company that no one knows and maybe they pay $20 an hour instead of $40 an hour, that is fine. They're not paying you as much as other companies might pay you to do a software engineering internship. But in terms of the build up on your resume, it will help. It won't help as much as if you had an internship at a company that most people know, like PayPal, but it will help more than not having it. And it will help more than, in my mind, it would help more than having some of the things I have lower on this list. I'll also say this is a rough priority order. This will all depend on the situation, the hiring manager, the recruiter. So this isn't a strict one is better than the other. Just my view of which ones will generally help a bit more or not, and I could be wrong. After that would be hackathon prizes. I got some prizes at some hackathons. I think they helped my resume quite a bit. So I would just put that next. If you can participate in hackathons, number 8 on my list is just hackathon projects in general. So it definitely helps build up your resume. They can also grow into side projects you can continue on after the hackathon, which also helps your resume. I would just encourage participate in hackathons, participate in extracurriculars where you're working on side projects, and any extra prizes, recognitions, maybe even investment in a side project that you can get will all help you get that interview a bit easier. So now I want to dig a bit into how do you get those jobs if you have an interview. It may seem strange, but the interview process is almost the same for any software engineering role, whether it be internship or someone with 10 years of experience. It's all kind of going to revolve around, can you pass a algorithm type interview question? What that means is basically what a lot of people call late code problems. I will leave that up to the audience to like go onto that website and look at some of the problems that they have. But the problems are going to be roughly kind of like FizzBuzz. So FizzBuzz is a very, I guess, traditional kind of basic interview problem where it basically asks if you have like a number divisible by 3, print fizz. If you have a number divisible by 5, print fizzbuzz. If you have a number divisible by 3 and 5, print fizzbuzz. And there are some variations on that of like, if it's neither of those, just print the number, or maybe print nothing. And maybe they'll expand on it in a few different ways. Same for any problem. They'll try to add variations on it or like expand it as you get the answer to the kind of base problem. So that could be something like, okay, what if you have something when it's divisible by 6? Or what if you want it to go from 1 to 1 million? How can you make it more efficient so it doesn't take an hour? So it can be pretty basic for things like a basic data structure like a stack, to something more complicated like binary numbers, like left and right shifting binary numbers, or dynamic programming. And those topics may not be familiar to people on this call, but like you can basically learn it by going on that website, or there are other websites like it. So I don't want to purely endorse LeetCode. But you can find problems like it, you can practice them, you can look up the concepts of like, how do these problems work and how do you learn how to complete them. There's also a famous book called Cracking the Coding Interview, which I would also recommend reading, because that will go into some of the like basic theories that these types of problems try to address, and it will be a bit more of a like learning experience as opposed to just practicing. But it's good to do both, like learn how the concepts work, learn how they generally get applied to problems, and then try to actually solve the types of interview problems that you would get. And I would really just emphasize, you can practice these. I've definitely met people who are kind of better at this by default. My brother actually doesn't work as a software engineer, but he is probably better at these types of problems than I am. And so some people are better at them, some people are worse, but you can practice these. I am firmly of the belief that this is not necessarily the best way to run a coding interview. I don't think it's entirely the most representative of, someone's abilities as a software engineer. But considering companies use it and it is something that you can practice pretty easily, I would just emphasize like, hey, this is how the hiring process works. Just practice these and it will help you pass interviews as long as you can get them. And I just wanted to hop back to like, why would you want to be a software engineer for a bit as we start to wrap up this talk. I would just say it's a good job. It tends to have good work-life balance. There are definitely some exceptions depending on the team, depending on the company. But in general, like what other companies are you gonna find where 40 hours a week is normal? You get paid so much. You can work from home. You get 1 to 2 years of work from home because of a pandemic. Just general flexibility, like I can come in late if I have a doctor's appointment. I can maybe make it up in the evening, or maybe if I've done my work efficiently, I don't really need to make it up. There's good benefits, there's good health insurance, good dental insurance. In fact, PayPal has a lot of more obscure benefits like paternal leave. So if you have a kid, even if you're the father and not the mother, you have some amount of leave to go spend with your kid. These are all benefits that are rare in jobs. Like you don't get paternity leave in most places in the US. But if you are in tech companies, I don't know how many, but a good percentage of companies do have those types of benefits. So I just highly recommend working in tech. It's also just more in demand. Like software engineers are more in demand than other jobs in the economy. So it ends up being easier to get interviews in other industries. Um, and as a result, it's also easier to pass those interviews than other industries. And I have a pretty good like anecdotal evidence towards that being true because when I graduated from Cornell as an Ivy League university as an economics major, I applied to like 4,000 jobs and didn't get a job offer. I went to grad school. I ended up getting like multiple job offers for software engineering roles, even though I didn't really start down the software engineering path, but because I was able to get the interviews because of my resume, and then I was able to pass the interviews because you can study for the interviews. I was able to get 4 or 5 times the salary that of most of the jobs I was interviewing for prior to applying to software engineer jobs. And to me, that spells out software engineering as one of the better jobs available to people. Especially, software engineering is also one of the jobs where it matters a bit less if you go to a top university or if you didn't have the best grades. Um, Not to say you should try to get bad grades or anything, but things are definitely a lot more open in a software engineering industry where people can get to companies like Google with a 2.5 GPA, as opposed to something like consulting or finance, where a lot of those applications will ask you for your GPA and they say, hey, we have a cutoff. If you don't have a 3.7 or above, then you're not getting interviewed. Um, so it's just kind of an easier job market. It pays well, it compensates better, it offers better benefits. That may not be universal, but some of the best jobs that you can find are definitely in the tech industry, and specifically maybe leaning toward software engineering roles in the tech industry. Um, as I mentioned before, I mean, you also just get paid to learn every day. I am rarely doing something mundane. I am usually learning something so that I can do a task. You do learn certain best practices, so you do get better at it, but you're typically learning something new to do your job. It's also a lot more collaborative than a lot of people expect. Um, I won't give exact hour numbers, but there are definitely meetings and there's definitely a lot of times when you're working with other people. Um, so it's not like you're just on a computer alone 24/7. Rather, it's you have a meeting and then from that meeting, you know kind of what to do, what to research or what to code or how to design your system. And you might have more meetings in between that as some kind of problem comes up with how that system or that code interacts with another team's code. So it ends up being very collaborative. So it's definitely not as antisocial as a lot of people think it is. Also, something I didn't really put in these slides is that tech tends to be pretty inclusive. That's not really a guarantee. There are tech companies, there are engineers who maybe aren't super inclusive, but at a lot of big tech companies and a lot of higher paying tech companies, there is a very strong culture of inclusion. Um, there are obviously examples towards the opposite, um, but I would say like if society is somewhere on like here for inclusion, then tech companies, especially higher paying ones, are somewhere above that. Um, and again, nothing's perfect, but if you're scared of tech because it's mostly men, for example, I wouldn't be because there are definitely tons of teams that are super inclusive, and I would count my team as one of them. And it definitely makes me happier that my team, my engineering team is more inclusive. And I probably would be a bit bummed if any team that I'm ever in is not as inclusive as this. Um, but if you compare this to certain other industries, there are entire industries where it's not very inclusive whatsoever. So I definitely think it's a good industry to be in. And there's definitely like you can kind of target that in your job search. to find companies and teams that are more accepting and more inclusive. And then kind of last, I think maybe one of the last benefits I'll point out is as you get more experience as a software engineer, you start to know kind of enough about how would you start up a tech company. So I don't know exact numbers, but I mean, there's definitely a lot of opportunity to, just say, hey, this isn't working out for me working for some other company. I'm going to go make an app and try to sell it, or I'm going to try to make some enterprise software or financial software and try to sell it. And that is definitely a legitimate path and it can work really well. One other topic I want to touch upon is how do you kind of succeed if you get your first engineering job or internship? I'll kind of skim over some of this because I want to leave some time for questions here. So if you have any questions, start typing them up and I'll get to them in like a minute or two. But if you have your first software engineering job or your first software engineering internship, just ask a lot of questions. I think what really helped me when I was an intern here at PayPal was just being willing to, if I got stuck, I was not going to just waste a ton of time trying to figure it out and failing to. I would go to my teammates and I would say, hey, I don't know where to start here. Can you point me in the right direction? I've tried X, Y, and Z. It hasn't worked so well, so I would appreciate some help. And that they may not tell you the answer, but they will say, hey, go look up this computer science concept, or that go look up the documentation for this library, and that would help immensely. And usually, your teammates just want to see that you are willing to learn and efficient at doing your work and learning what you don't know. So definitely just try to Google often, ask a lot of questions. I would also say like regularly meeting with your manager can help kind of uncover any areas where you might be like struggling or weak at, so that you can spend some extra effort on those. I'd also recommend like be involved in extracurriculars. This will apply more to bigger companies, but given the opportunity, like try to write blog posts, try to give tech talks about any subject that you're knowledgeable upon, and that will help get your name known in your job or your internship, and that will, help you succeed. Other than that, like come prepared. I think this slide kind of outlines some of the stuff that you should try to know. Emphasis on knowing REST, databases, Git, Agile, code reviews, data visualization, some software design principles, and like how to create some good diagrams to represent a technical system. And then like some kind of like newer technology stacks that are in demand are cloud, GraphQL. Someone mentioned mobile development. That can also be a big plus for certain opportunities. And please, I recommend going back in the recording after the fact and looking at this slide again, because like this is bare bones of what I would want from a like intern at PayPal. If an intern knew all of this stuff, they would be leagues ahead of most people starting out in a job. Oh, that is, I believe, my last slide. So does anyone have any questions? We've got about 5 minutes to answer some questions. We did have one question earlier about how to make a better deal once you have a job offer. I won't go too much into this. I'll basically say you should kind of always negotiate a job offer. This is going to apply a lot less to an internship. Like for an internship, probably just negotiate if you have multiple offers, especially from bigger tech companies, or higher paying tech companies. But for any job offer, just try asking for like 10 or 20% more. I would say it's less than 5% chance that anyone rescinds a job offer because you asked for more, and more likely than not that you can get 10 or 20% more. Any other? Oh, there we go.
We have one more.
So this next one was, would I recommend getting a master's degree or a PhD to go into the tech industry? Does it have benefits? Um, I would say this is a very like complex topic. I would say like getting a master's degree really helped me, and that was largely because I didn't major in computer science. So having a degree that just says computer science on my resume is definitely helpful. But in general, like companies need software engineers. If you have a bachelor's in something technical, then that is often going to be enough. Um, I don't think there's many companies that even show up on levels.fyi. So, companies that pay more that require or prefer masters or PhDs. But that being said, like a PhD is necessary for certain fields. In a way, not entirely, but if you want to be like a lead, uh, like HCI researcher at a Google or something, then you tend to need a PhD. So it's kind of situational. It will help sometimes, and other times it won't really matter. So I would say maybe pursue like an online master's of computer science if you aren't getting many interviews, and that will help a lot. But otherwise, at that point, you should know whether or not you would need a PhD to achieve your career goals. Um, so, I wouldn't default to it, is what I'm saying. Like, definitely try to get jobs out of your bachelor's in computer science or something like that. And only if you have trouble, then maybe start going for a master's or PhD. Um, Even then, like probably a master's, because a PhD only if you really want to specialize in something. Um, Someone asked, does it matter if you get a bachelor's of science or a bachelor's in arts? No. Um, Sometimes the curriculum is different. Like Cornell had both a bachelor's of science and a bachelor of arts. From what I could tell, the bachelor's of science did have some more engineering classes, but companies didn't really care which one you had. People did just fine either way. How can people from an untraditional background get internship opportunities? Most require students to be pursuing a computer science degree. I would say that tends to be true. Um, One good way would be to look, as much as I was, kind of putting down lower paying software engineering jobs. If you can get a junior software engineer role for like a year, then that will basically make it so that, it doesn't really matter that you're untraditional. And then you'll get more interviews for any type of software engineering job. So, you can kind of look for companies that don't really pay fair market value. I classify them that way. You can call it junior software engineer job or whatever. But you can kind of look for some of those companies that will maybe be a bit more open. And you can try applying to those and getting experience that way. Internships are maybe going to be a bit harder because as you noted, a lot of them do require you to be pursuing a degree. For that, I would say I got mine at PayPal because I was doing an online master's of computer science. So that's an option if you have a bachelor's. If you don't have a bachelor's, you can try reaching out to smaller companies or startups, and you may be able to find an opportunity that way. Alternatively, really just building up some of this stuff that I mentioned before of, where was it? This one. You can do research with computer science professors, even if you're not a student at that university. It will be a bit harder, but if you start emailing professors around you, like, or even ones in different cities, some will be open to like you working with them. Open source contributions are something anyone can do. Uh, Hackathons are sometimes restricted to students, but there are a lot that are open to anyone. And side projects, like all of that is stuff you can try to build up. Hopefully that helps. I think untraditional backgrounds are a bit tougher. I mean, I had one and I found it tough at first until I got the Georgia Tech Masters. So there are definitely like a lot of different ways to do it, and just kind of being willing to try to get a lower paying software engineering job for a year would definitely help. Someone asked, would you recommend using libraries during front-end development or just hard coding out? Use libraries. I mean, I think I'm not a front-end engineer, but front-end engineering is pretty library heavy. Even back-end engineering uses a lot of libraries. Like in general in software development, no one really hard codes everything out. But I think this will kind of depend on the situation. Working in frameworks, for example, we need to get, heck, even in most big companies, you kind of need to get libraries vetted, because if a library has some kind of malicious code in it, you don't want to be using it. And that has been seen in a few hacks here and there in the industry. But in general, if that code has been audited, like use that library, it will help you out, unless you have other requirements around like performance or something like that that you need to control. Then there's, what are hackathon prizes that people won during hackathons? Do people use hackathons for networking with companies too? Hackathons are an odd topic because hackathons have kind of decreased in popularity for recruiting, but they kind of still help as resume items. But a lot of hackathons do have companies recruiting there. So you can drop off your resume with a company, and that can lead to interviews for internships or jobs. So I definitely recommend them. The prizes, there tend to be a few different categories of prizes. It can either be, what is the most socially impactful, or, what is the best product out here, or the most feasible product. So there are a lot of different categories. It can just depend. A lot of the time they also come with, cash prize or some kind of other prize. So I got like a drone one time I was able to sell for like $200. I got $300 in cash for another one. And, sometimes that's barely the cost of actually attending that hackathon, because you might need to pay for like a plane ticket or a bus ticket or an Airbnb. But if you can find ones close to you, then I definitely recommend it. I think we're just about out of time, so thank you everyone for the great questions. I hope this helped, and I hope that some of these lists of what to focus on and what technology to learn can help y'all in getting high-paying jobs and the right opportunities and everything.
Thank you so much for spending your time with us, James, and teaching us about this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank you for answering everyone's questions too, James.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, everyone. Have a great
Bye,
day.
everyone. Have a great day.